Good. James, thank you so much for joining us.
Yes, nice to be here.
How are you?
I'm doing good. I was listening to a part of a podcast you were doing with, I think it was Anita, right? Talking about her kid and bad sleep. And we're pretty much in the same kind of thing. So ours is a year old and he has the sleep regression going on.
Oh, damn.
Yeah. So besides that, I'm
rough nights.
Rough nights, though.
How do you deal with it?
Just muscle through.
Just powering through.
Just powering through and try to go to bed early. It's a good way of practicing feedback with your kid, right? When you're tired and stressed.
Yeah.
So,
what kind of feedback does he give you, and how do you interpret that? Because the feedback is going to be today's topic, but how do you deal with the feedback that your kid is giving you?
Well, so this is my son. So I have a daughter of 4 and a son who's 1. He's pretty direct. He just cries, right? If he doesn't like it, he cries, and then I figure out, okay, what's up? What's going on? And usually it's food or tired, right? Or those kinds of things. And then I just see what works. That's basically it. See how I can connect with him. Sometimes it's just laughing or smiling at him is enough.
Yeah.
My daughter's a different ballgame.
She's a bit more vocal,
she's
vocal. More verbal. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think this already ties into the little pre-discussion that we just had. Feedback, the idea of feedback, it's different per person, and not everyone understand what feedback is. A lot of people, especially in this country, just complain. They like, you're doing your job in a sucky way. That's their part of feedback, right? Yeah. But that's not feedback how it's intended. Yeah. Tell us how you perceive the idea, the notion of feedback, what it is and what it's not.
Yeah. So if you ask me, so a lot of how I like to talk about feedback is from nonviolent communication. So I think that's the foundation, right? This is Marshall Rosenberg who came with that. And basically what it's about is how can we enrich each other's lives, right? How can we meet each other's needs? And the fundamental belief is that we can always meet each other's needs. You don't have to do things out of guilt or give up what's important to you. We can find a way that works for us all. So I like to also take then the definition of Mickey Kashtan, who's also a big name within nonviolent communication. And that is, it's about how can we expand capacity towards a shared purpose that we have. And that's it. And the interesting thing is if that is your kind of mindset behind it, it's a lot different than telling people about what their blind spots are or what their weaknesses are or where they need to grow and those kinds of things. So it creates a different dynamic.
Because you mentioned non-violent communication.
Yeah.
What's the difference between regular and violent? What's the threshold for things to become violent communication?
Yeah. I think it's interesting to look at Gandhi actually in that regard, right? So he had non-violence was of course his trademark, and non-violence as it's defined then is violence, which could be like a physical violence, right, using fists, but it can also be about violence in terms of your mind or what you think of people and having enemy images. So violence to me could be anything within that spectrum of how you think of a person and address them.
Interesting.
Up until physical violence, of course.
Jim, any thoughts? Because I see you nodding.
Well, yeah, a number of years ago, I had a leader who basically asked our entire team to read the nonviolent communication book, and we practiced it. We had specific sessions that were intended to help us learn it as a team because the team was going through some conflict, and we were helping our clients navigate their own conflict. So it was kind of extremely applicable for a variety of reasons. And I really enjoyed it. I am by no means the best NVC practitioner out there, but what I took away from it is, if nothing else, even if people are new or don't care for the NVC model, thinking about what's happening, like just getting really clear about what is actually happening, the facts.
Yeah.
What is that making you feel? And then what do you need from someone else?
Yeah.
And we could write books on that. I mean, in fact, there have been books on that. But I do you see those as kind of like the 3 big elements of NVC?
Yeah, there's one more part to that, which is the request, right? So the need is what is important to me. So for example, if you take a need of intimacy, that can be met in very many different ways, deciding on who you are, right? So for some people, intimacy is a cuddle. For other people, it's going out to a lunch together. And the request is actually making a specific request in terms of what might fulfill that need that you have going on. So that 4th component to me still belongs in there as well.
Yeah. And something else that's related, but not necessarily a part of feedback or NVC is understanding what type of a conversation we're having, or want to have, because that's something that team struggled with, which is what ultimately led us to NVC. Is we had a team of 6 at the time. 4 of us would show up thinking we're having a brainstorming session. One person would show up needing to vent, and one person would show up wanting to just get right down to brass tacks and start executing. And I find with feedback that's applicable, because different people need different things. And if you're going to have a feedback discussion, do you have some tips about like how to set the stage for that, or how to open that, or even how to schedule it in a calendar?
Yeah.
For example.
Yeah. So I think the simplest thing in terms of opening it is basically to ask if somebody is open to having that conversation. I know this sounds trivial or simple, but that is the reality. And sometimes, if for example, I've just given a presentation, right? I was tense about it, and somebody is starting to give feedback to me. The odds are I'm not in a place that I'm thinking, yeah, let's have this conversation, right? I'm not there. So just simply asking is already a good step. And what was the other piece that you were asking about? Oh, yeah, about scheduling.
Yes, and I'll share a personal failing of my own about why I'm asking. Is I was, and probably still am mostly, the type of person who, if you schedule time with me and we're working together in some sort of professional capacity, and I don't know what we're about to talk about, my mind will run off and be like, oh, yeah, he wants to have a chat. Like, did I piss him off in that call yesterday, or did I do this? Or even worse, if you send an invite that says feedback on your recent presentation, like, and if you schedule that 4 days from now, I'm going to be nervous that for those 4 days, even if I did nothing wrong.
Yeah, I fully agree. And that's the worst of the worst, right? When you send that email for over 4 days, I want to give you feedback because your mind goes wild on what that's going to be about. It's terrible. So, personally, I advise for many things to just, you might have been in a meeting, right? Something occurs, to just say, hey, do you have 5 minutes now after the meeting? We can just have a short chat, because then you remove that anxiety that a person has. You can check in with them after that, asking, hey, I have some feedback for you. I'd like to share my experience on this or that. Are you open to that? And then it's a kind of a contained, okay experience. So I think only unless we're getting to the point that it's already intense, right, and it's a big topic, stay away from scheduling.
Oh, agreed. And I think there's another layer to that, which is often unaddressed, is that no is still an acceptable answer, right? If I'm going to approach you, like, I've got some feedback, I noticed something that's going on, right? I would like to share that with you. Is that okay? And then we get to Jim's pet peeve on feedback is a gift. Not every piece of feedback is perceived as a gift. Maybe for me as the giving person, I want to give you the feedback, but I definitely don't always receive feedback as a gift. Sometimes it feels like a blow in the face with a baseball bat.
Yeah.
So saying no to feedback is still fine, right? What's your opinion on that?
I think it's fine to say no. Also MVC is not about forcing anything down anybody's throat or having them do things out of guilt or shame or that kind of thing, right? So if that's not something that you want, then that's fine. There are situations in which such a decision can have consequences, right? So say I'm a manager to somebody and I'm really concerned about certain behaviors and I want to talk about them, and I keep hearing, no, I don't want to talk about that. Then that might put me in a difficult situation that we might have to talk about.
Yeah.
So it's fine, but it can have consequences.
If I exclude the team I'm referencing from my 27-year career, I can count on one hand the amount of times that I have asked somebody, may I give you feedback, and had them say no.
Mm-hmm.
And then sometimes it goes terribly. And I say later, maybe over drinks or a month later, hey, remember that argument we had, or that disagreement or whatever? Can we talk about that? And they're like, well, I wasn't in a place to hear that. I'm like, but you said you were. And they've admitted to me, and I felt this myself, being asked if somebody can give you feedback is great, but it doesn't feel okay to say no.
The interesting thing is when you were giving that feedback to that person, did you have a sense that that no was out of some kind of, for lack of a better word, like conformity, or that the person thought they needed to do that? Did you have any vibe of their yes, the quality of their yes?
The
For a
quality of
huge
yes,
part of my career, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Sunder.
no. That's just a statement. I like the quality of yes. I like that.
Yeah, I mean, yes and no are binary, but it's when it's really about are you being honest? You know, if I say yes, am I being honest? If I say no, am I being honest? And what I will say is, for a huge part of my career, I probably didn't even pick up on any indicator that they were saying yes to my face, but their body or something else was saying no. It's only in the last, let's say, 8 to 10 years that I pick up on those things. And I still miss signals all the time. Like, ask any woman I've spent any amount of time with. I miss signals, right? I do think I'm better at it now. And I would like to think that far less signals go by me, unspoken or spoken.
Do you know what I wonder though? And I'm not speaking for you, right? Your experience can be different, but I think for a lot of people, the idea of giving feedback is already very stressful, right? So, you know, especially with when you have to think about, okay, what was my observation, my feeling, my needs, my request? That's already a stressful thing. And you might be worried about, okay, are we going to get into a conflict? What's going to happen to our relationship? You know, we value harmony. So if you're really stressed out, and I can very much imagine how you're starting that conversation, your heart is up. Like for me, right? I'm in a podcast the first time, heart rate's up, that you don't pick up on those kinds of things. And that later, as you get more comfortable with, then you get more space to see, okay, what is their body telling me, right? What's happening there? So I could imagine that there might have been stress at the start in those initial years. Does that make sense to you?
Absolutely. I've got a lot of other thoughts, but I want to hear from Sunder. Like, I know that as a trainer, primarily, I know that's not all you do, and you're working a lot with clients, but how does feedback come up in what you do as a trainer? Like, do you talk to your peers in some sort of regular or structured way about getting better as a group, as a person?
That's a good question. There are multiple layers to this. Again, yes and no, because the way I like to get feedback is directly, right? That could be, in this case, you're asking about my peers. I would like them to be part of my course as well, so they can actually see me do my job and then provide me feedback on that. Now, my peers, I'm assuming you meant other trainers, not necessarily my students, right?
Yeah, I meant like other people at your company or organization that you work with.
Yeah. So I do require them to be with me in order to get feedback from them. Right. And luckily we have the luxury that we have fairly big classes. So from time to time we do co-train, and I always ask feedback because I want to get that. Both from students as well as the co-trainers that I have. I want to get feedback, and I just ask them for it. Like, do you have any feedback? Are there things I could do differently? Because I know my intonation can be a struggle for me sometimes. I can, especially if I start rambling and there's a lot of text I want to get out of my head, I can start speaking very monotonous unless I'm very aware of it. So these are things I do want to get quite quickly. So I continuously throughout the day ask for feedback. And we at Zebia have XKEs, as they call that, Zebia Knowledge Exchange. So from time to time, there are sessions there where we pop up as trainers and talk about that. The same we have the Day of the Trainer, as I call that, where we just gather here and talk about our profession as a trainer. Does that answer your question, Jim?
It does. And now I have a question to James. So I don't know, James, if you heard what I just heard, but I heard Sunder say the word require. So am I correct in assuming you put some sort of constraints around who's allowed to give you feedback? And I'm curious, where I'm going with this is what James's opinion on that is as our feedback expert, if that's a good thing or a bad thing.
So the question is to me what the requirements are for my feedback.
I guess it's a question to you, and then based on your answer, I'm curious what James thinks.
No, I don't necessarily have any feedback or requirements for my feedback. Who can give me feedback honestly, anyone can give me feedback. However, I'm not saying or guaranteeing that I will do anything with your feedback. Yeah. That's the thing. And that's coming back to the anxiety. That's something that I had to learn over the years as well. I became aware that feedback is not a necessity
Yeah.
to do something with.
Yeah.
I can do something with it if it fits my vision.
Yes.
If I do think it makes my courses, for instance, better, because now we're talking about training, and I do feel it fits my style. Sometimes people request me to talk in a bit more corporate, more formal way, and that doesn't fit me.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. And I'm fully on board with that. And I think, if you think about it from a common sense perspective, that is also common sense, in the sense that, of course, if somebody gives you feedback, and it's nice that you're welcoming of it, but you don't always have to do something. It's exactly what you say. If it doesn't align with your vision of where you want to go or what is important to you, then it's fine to leave it as is. I do think it can be nice to then express to that person that, I am hearing this and I value the feedback that you're getting. And at this point, I can't connect with it. So that at least you have a talk about that. They know, okay, I don't have to expect that Sander's now going to talk in corporate language around me, right? Something like that.
Exactly.
Yeah, absolutely.
And the reason I asked this question, James, is a colleague of mine, Chris. He's big on what he calls the feedback pyramid, and thinking about how much feedback do we need and from whom. And if you give me feedback on my driving today, James, I'm going to be like, yeah, dude, I don't care what you say because you've never been in a vehicle with me.
Mm-hmm.
And it would be reasonable, in my opinion, if Sunder said to a colleague, if you want to give me feedback on my training, you better at least be in the room.
Yes.
And even if they're in the room once, he might train 80 times next year. So as a pyramid, one person sitting in one class giving him feedback may not be as valuable as one person sitting in 20 classes giving him feedback. So I think we could probably all agree to those ideas, but to make it more practical for the audience, James, is there any tips or ways that you would visualize this, or you would suggest somebody think about different people giving them feedback?
So I hope I'm answering your question in this, right? I think my perspective on this is, when you're asking for feedback, it's always most useful to ask for feedback with people that have actually worked with you and that have been able to observe you and that can actually say something meaningful. Because it also reminds me a little bit of when I started out in consultancy, right? And then as a young professional, you get sent out to your client, and I spoke to my manager maybe once a month, and they come in and they say, how are you doing? I say, I'm doing pretty good. How's your client doing? My client's doing fine as well. I'm still here. Thank you. Okay, I'll see you next month, right? And then 6 months later, you have this half-year evaluation, or you have your end-of-year evaluation, and you get things like, well, James, I think you're doing a good job with your client. I see you around the office sometimes. Maybe you could work on these leadership skills. And you really don't have much of an idea of what you're hearing because this person hasn't worked with you. They don't really know. And seldom they put in the effort to get feedback from the people that work directly with you. And it gets even more complicated because even the people that work with you might lack in a competence for feedback. So they are also saying like, well, James communicates well, or he's a nice guy to work with, which again doesn't help very much. So I think, coming back to your question, essentially, when you're asking for feedback, it's most useful when people can actually give observations instead of just judgments or an innate feeling that they have about how you perform. Is that an answer?
I think it's a great answer.
Okay.
That's why I really still hate that this is still a thing where a manager, whether that's my line manager or another manager, comes up to me and he's like, hey, here's your annual review. I've asked collected feedback from all your peers. And now I'm going to regurgitate the feedback through my lens, and I'm going to use that however I feel fit.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's an awkward conversation too, right? Because then you say, because it's a generalization that they don't have that context, right? And then you ask, okay, so could you give me an example of where you've seen this behavior, right? So if you're telling me I need to work on my leadership skills, what was the situation then that I wasn't performing up to expectation?
Exactly.
Say, well, I can't tell you that, I'm afraid.
Yeah.
But it needs work.
I have these observations based on stuff that I didn't actually see, but here's my feedback.
Yeah.
But why is this still a thing? Why does that recur?
I think there are just practical difficulties to it. So I think, a part of the mission that we have is how can we improve the quality of feedback? So for example, if you can get 360s, right? So if I'm a manager and I'm not sitting with my team, I'm not in that team, and we can improve the quality of feedback, then 360s that we ask from other team members start to become meaningful. because they can say, I was sitting with you in this session and I noticed that you raised your voice when another team member did this or that. Now, that's something that we can talk about, right? That's something. And if we can then even get team members to the point that they'll sit down and share that feedback so that you can have a dialogue about it, now it becomes a system that might actually work.
Exactly.
And in general, I'm very much prefer that when we're working with teams, that a manager actually works together with their team, because then you can see how they're doing. That isn't always possible, but ideally, a construct like that.
Do you feel in that regard that managers are still the adequate people to give feedback if they're not involved in their actual day-to-day job?
So I think it really depends on what the quality is of the 360. I think it's if the quality of the feedback that they're collecting from peers around that person is very poor, it becomes extremely difficult. You get into the situation we just talked about, and then I worry. Yes, because how can you have a fruitful conversation about, okay, in what areas should I grow and what kind of respect should I grow in those areas? It becomes impossible.
What's the ideal construct? If you can sketch a scenario, what's the ideal construct to give feedback to? Let's say you're my manager, I'm your, I don't care, developer, one of your team members. What is the requirement that you would consider to be the perfect environment to actually give feedback?
So this is also, I think, where a little bit the topic of company culture comes in, right? So if we have a safe company culture, which is flat, right, and we feel comfortable with each other, I believe very much in the construct of having a team lead in a team. So they're working together, they're seeing what you're doing, how you're positioning yourself in meetings. And I think that can be a very powerful thing. That would be my setup. But that's not always possible, right? So if you're a manager of Scrum Masters, you're not in their teams where they are working, it becomes more difficult, and the 360 becomes a lot more important.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Should we then still have managers giving, in this scenario, right? We have a manager of multiple Scrum Masters. Is that still then useful to actually have a manager give and provide feedback to those Scrum Masters if they're not there? Or should that solely be up to the Scrum team to give the feedback to that?
I think it's both. So as a manager, I expect you're having conversations with your Scrum Master on their day-to-day, and I hope you've built up the relationship with these people that they are willing to share with you the good and bad, and that you can talk about the good and bad, and that they know you're not going to hit me in the face with the good and bad. I can trust that you're going to deal with this constructively. And it's also about, how can you help them to get more quality from the input from that team that helps both you and helps both them. So I'm absolutely not advocating for that construct can't work, but we need to put the work in to get the quality there and the relationship that supports that feedback.
I like that.
Yeah.
Jim, what's the worst piece of feedback that you ever got?
Ooh. Wow, I had an immediate phrase flash in my brain. You were awesome, don't change a thing. And now, it was the worst. Yeah, go ahead.
I can imagine people who are now listening are like, that's not bad feedback at all. That's awesome.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, audience, that is exactly the phrase that flashed in my head before I had time to process even the questions Sunder said. I remember being given that, and it was by somebody I work with. They had a lot of direct observational time with me, so I felt like they were in a position and had seen me for many, many times when I knew I was not at my best, which is why I would say it was the worst, because I knew it wasn't true. Don't change a thing means there's no room for improvement. There's been I have a laundry list of negative feedback that I have considered crap. Most of the things that made them crap is either I was getting feedback from somebody with no direct or even remotely direct experience with the thing they were giving me feedback on. And which is why I asked the question earlier, right? Like, yeah. So that's my immediate answer is it was perfect. Don't change a thing.
Does it affect your view on that person as well, on the giver of the feedback?
In this example, no, it did not. If it had happened many times or from other people, it might have said, oh, well, they don't care enough to give me good feedback, or they weren't paying attention. I've had that happen. I've had an example where I asked somebody to come specifically to give me feedback. And when I circled back with them after the session and said, "What's your feedback?" they hemmed and hawed. And I basically found out they weren't even paying attention. They were on their phone. They were on their laptop, tapping away, replying to messages. And it's like, I mean, come on, this company paid you to be in this room to give me feedback, and you couldn't even be bothered for 90 minutes to pay attention. So, I mean, and that was someone I liked.
Now, coming back to you, James, you were talking about the request of the feedback, right? You're an expert in this. Now, we're hearing Jim talk about this way of feedback. What would you consider the hidden request being in here that's not formulated as a request?
From Jim to this other person?
Yeah.
I think to a certain degree, it's about being seen, right? So I'm hearing the story about this person is getting into this meeting for 90 minutes. The agreement was that he would give you feedback after, and afterwards, if I'm interpreting it correctly, he didn't have much to tell you. And so there might have been some anxiety from yours from the fact that you're being observed. And now you're not really being seen by this person, or that might be the experience in sharing what was up for them.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's fair in this case. And
Knowledge,
one
right?
organization I worked at before, because Slender, you asked a question about like a structure, and something a team that I was on did is we created what was called a lead forward. So the opposite of feedback, right? And what we meant by that was, tomorrow we're all going to go to this other building for 8 hours and do this thing. Who needs feedback on what? I'm going to be sitting in the room. What would you like me to observe? Because facilitating a room of 50 smart people doing things for 8 hours, I can't pick up on everything. I can't watch body language. So as a team, we had kind of said, you're going to, Dilip, you're going to watch the clock, the agenda. You're going to do that. You're going to keep us speakers and presenters on target. Other people were watching engagement and activities. Other people were looking at nonverbals. And I think the lead forward aspect of feedback was, we had a plan to go in so that when we did look backwards, it was really valuable. And I think as a group, that's why we improved very, very quickly, because we had to be honest.
Yeah. What I also like about that is that it's embracing interdependence, right? So you're saying that, I have some support in tracking time, I have some support maybe in tracking nonverbal behavior. And instead of thinking I need to do all of this because I might be the host or, I'm the trainer, that you're actually using others and making use of them to support you in that area. And I also love that idea, right? So a lot in companies we talk about, we expect somebody to do it all themselves. And it's not feasible, and it's not necessary either. It's good that we expand capacity through others.
Yeah.
Well, and I was a trainer when COVID hit, and I did a lot of what Sunder does right now. And I remember having a discussion with my team and at my company, because, we had to basically move overnight, literally overnight, from teaching 30 people in a classroom with physical materials, flip charts, whiteboards, all the things that come along with that, good and bad, to teaching online. So we created this role called a proctor. And a proctor was somebody who's going to come in and they're going to do a lot of those things you just mentioned. They're going to watch the clock. They're going to help people that are struggling with the technology, right? Remember, think about however you were feeling week 1 of COVID, and that's what I'm talking about. Well, the company said, there's no economics in that. Like, we can't afford to pay 2 people to do what last week 1 person did. And I loved those classes having a proctor, because it allowed me to focus on what I was doing, knowing that somebody else was focusing on some other things. And yeah, it didn't make a lot of sense, but I remember a number of us went to the company and said, but what's the value, the ROI on getting this wrong or improving this?
Yeah.
Right. But from a sheer, so I guess to phrase this around a question, because the audience knows I'm shit at asking questions sometimes. Is there a way that you've seen or that you would suggest to put an ROI or a value to feedback? Like just the act of getting feedback, not any one piece of feedback, but just to getting good as a company, as a team, as a group with feedback.
I think that's a difficult question to answer, to put a numerical value on it, right? So it's basically like, how does this impact your bottom line? Is that kind of like your question? How would we measure how this impacts our bottom line?
Yeah, or even if we can't, like, I agree, it would be hard to get it to one number, but let's say you had to make the case to leadership to make time or space or budget for feedback. How would you start that?
Well, I think, it's foundational in teams, right? If we take Scrum teams and we're developing products and you don't have a system of feedback, right? You're already pretty much screwed, right? So let's imagine that we're trying to find solutions to problems within our teams and we don't have feedback in our teams. Then it's a very likely situation that we might go with a design decision or a product decision that actually doesn't make much sense because we are scared or afraid to give feedback on the input that we're hearing from others. And that's just one example of a product decision, but this can be on all kinds of levels. What if we have one person who's quite domineering, right, in a management team, and we're afraid to give feedback to this person, and now we've gone in a direction of which half the management team think this is a really poor thing, but I don't dare give feedback. We're in a really bad place. So I think in any level that you look at where feedback is absent, we're in a problem. It's as simple as that. It's everywhere. And I think one of the troubles with feedback is, and this is something that has been occupying my mind recently, is that, do you know what the origin is of soft and hard skills? Where those terms come from? You have an idea, Jim?
No.
Okay. So if I'm not mistaken, it's from the US Army, actually. And hard skills was everything to do with steel and weapons. And soft skills was basically everything else. But the association that came with that was, of course, the hard is the manly stuff, right? And then the soft skills is the more feminine side of things. And interestingly, actually, the Army a couple of years later said we should actually discontinue this terminology because it's exacerbating biases and that kind of thing. But it stuck around. And what I find interesting is that I wonder whether certain biases, or those systemic preconceptions that we have about feedback are actually what gets in the way of that we don't talk about it easily and putting more attention into it. Now, this is just a thesis, right? I'm in the point of investigating this, but it is an interesting one because just going to add one last piece to that, which is Hofstede that does that research did the research into cultural dimensions, right? And one of his dimensions also focuses on masculinity versus femininity, where masculinity is plotted to kind of task direction and femininity more towards the people side of things. So it's interesting to look at how do those biases actually influence also how in organizations we look at these topics. So I wanted to bring that piece into the lens as well.
Ironically, soft skills are usually the hardest anyway. Because if I'm coming back to the Army, if I'm gonna ask one of those Navy SEALs, not that I've ever done that, so this is an assumption, but if I'm gonna give him a task like do 300 push-ups, he's gonna jump right to the floor, he's gonna do 300 push-ups, look at me being awesome. Now, all right, after you're done, talk about how your daddy treated you when you were 3 years old. Now he's gonna crack, right? And these kind of things are a lot harder. My therapist always calls this the silent generation, like the generation before us. They were, especially men, they were not taught how to deal with these kind of emotions because exactly the masculine versus feminine. We're not being told or taught how to do so. And not just the generation before us, but even the generation before that, and so on and so on. And now we're sort of trying to break free from that, and we have to, because we are dealing with so much complexity, whether that's in the products that we're dealing with, the way that we communicate, but also our social structures, especially given the social media platforms that we have. You have to do something with that, because else the suicide rates are going to skyrocket, burnout rates are going to go up, and you have to teach people how to do that. And that starts, well, you were talking about your kids. I'm definitely doing that with my kids to and I'm not, by no means I'm perfect at that, but we're teaching them to talk about their feelings, be open about that, because at least then we can do something with that, right? And if there's a hidden demon inside you that you don't know how to deal with, the only way that I can help you with that, if you're open to that, is by talking about it. So at least I have some guidelines of what's going on with James. Like, I see your quality of work deteriorating as a leader. And it's really hard it's really easy for my position to make a judgment call about that, because I see like the direct consequences, but I don't see the root cause. And if you're struggling at home with your kids, with your relationship, with something else, with yourself, I'm going to make decisions. I'm jumping to conclusions based on information that I don't have.
Okay.
But we're not taught how to deal with that.
Yeah.
And that brings me back to the request, because we're not taught how to formulate our need of feedback as a request. So for people who are listening to this right now and they want to make a start by doing that, what would you recommend?
To ask for feedback?
Yeah, and how to formulate, how to dig into yourself what your need is for feedback and how you would formulate that request.
I think that's already a difficult thing in the sense that, now we've just talked about what the difficulties are of feelings, expressing feelings and the lexicon surrounding that. But then there's also all this difficulty surrounding observations and how we've been taught to think in judgments. We haven't been taught to think in observations. There's a lot of area to explore there too. And then being in touch with our needs, just being able to find out what our needs are, is extremely difficult for most people. So a lot of also about feedback training is how do we teach people to connect to their needs, and in the sense of requesting for feedback. I just believe in keeping it easy, and it could be, if you want something specific, say like, I've been struggling with how I create structure to my presentations that people can easily follow. I'd love it if you would share what your experience is in my coming presentation. That would be a fantastic way to ask it. Is that?
Yeah. The image that popped to mind with me, and I'm also looking at you for your opinion on this, Jim. If I'm going to go to one of my colleagues and I ask them that I don't necessarily have a really good relationship with, and I ask them, like, what do you need from me? I need you to shut the fuck up and leave me alone. Like, there's a different hidden request there, but how can you unlock that?
What do you mean exactly?
Like the person who's telling me to shut up and leave them alone, there usually is something different in there that's going on. But they don't know, they don't know how to formulate that or how to get that out, because often it's such a storm inside their brain as well and inside their heart that's really hard to put that to words. And I know I suffer from that too. That those are not necessarily my heart, my brain can be connected, or the other way around, heart, my brain. But how to get them vocalized, and mentalized, that's really hard.
What is going on for this person?
Yeah, and how to put that out in words.
Yeah. So it's, in this case, it's quite a difficult one because you're getting a pretty extreme reaction, right? So there are different ways to go based on your relationships. If you have, in your case, you don't have a very good relationship, or maybe if you do have a good relationship, you could just say, whoa, it sounds like you've got a lot going on right now. Do you want to tell me about it? It can be something like that, and you can see what happens. And maybe they have just a need for peace. Maybe they're just really concerned, they're anxious, and they just have a need for peace, and you just need to leave them. And then talk to them at a time when they're kind of cooled off. And then it could be something like, I noticed when I tried to have a conversation with you the other day that you seemed like really frustrated or angry. Would you be willing to share what's going on for you back then? And then that can be the opening. And they might say no, but they might say, yeah, I was stressed out. I'm not sleeping because my kids are having trouble, which is my world. And it can start the conversation.
Yeah. Jim, what's your view on that?
Yeah, I think it kind of comes back to what that extreme reaction you were getting was probably saying, this is not the right time to get any feedback, or this is not the right time for me to give you that type of feedback. Which begs the question, like, if there's never a right time, that's a problem. That means somebody is closed off to feedback in general, and I'm sure we've all been guilty of that at various times. But I think it comes back to the ideal scenario is the right type of feedback, whether it's negative or positive or whatever, at the right time. And that's just kind of what I was thinking about when you posed that scenario, Senator, because I've probably been on both sides of that many times. The person reacting poorly in the moment, and the person, whoa, sorry, I thought now was the right time. Clearly it's not, because I just was wrong. Maybe I misread a signal or something. And this is kind of a segue to my next question for James, which is, what do you think in 2025 about the common practice that I see almost everywhere still of managers having scheduled one-on-ones? So I have a really, really good and close friend who was talking to me last week and needed advice. And he was interviewing for a leadership role, and an aspect of that job is you're going to have X amount of direct reports. You're expected from the company to do one-on-one with each person every month. And he just did the math. He's like, look, 60% of my week is going to be having scheduled one-on-ones with people.
So
Is it dismaying to you that in 2025 we're still there, or is that a good thing? And I'm the idiot here.
Well, it's not about being an idiot. What the first thing that comes to mind is how many direct reports does this person have? Because he sounds like he has an awful lot of direct reports. If 60% of your week is going to be spent on that, right? So I'm wondering, I think a question can be, don't certain managers have simply too many direct reports? I know of managers that have 40 direct reports. How are you going to build relationships? How are you going to coach 40 people? How are you going to prepare valuable conversations with 40 people? It's not doable. So I think or at least that's my impression, the better conversation is about, okay, what is an ideal number that can be done in a meaningful way?
Exactly. It was my follow-up question. Like, is there any scientific number that has a drop-off point for direct reports to have meaningful and deepened relationships to keep that feedback valuable?
Not that I have in my mind right now, but personally, I'd say it would be somewhere between maybe 7 and 10, something like that. I mean, you can always do more, but it's just going to mean that you're going to have to reduce in some way, perhaps the quality of the connection with each of them, right? Until you get to the point that it becomes that generic stuff that we talked about earlier.
Now, the thing that pops in mind with me, and I'm sure this is going to resonate with you as well, Jim, especially in corporate America, there's always a fun topic. But now, if we're going to stick to 7 to 10 people per manager, aren't we just going to create a massive overhead of more managers just to keep those things in line? Like, is there a business case behind that would be valuable and that actually would sell this concept to an organization?
Yeah. So first, I do want to say I don't know if there's science to back a certain number, right? The reasoning that goes in my mind is just the more people you get, the lighter the connection is going to be. That's the reasoning I have behind that. And I think it's a good point. It might be that if you have these smaller groups, that you will get a huge overhead and you might have to deal with that. I don't have a direct answer to what is an ideal there. But I do believe that if you want to coach people to get better, and managers are already busy also with just the contextual aspects of their work, you're going to need to give them time and to work through that and to keep a structured idea of what have we been talking about and what steps are we making to improve. So you have to find the balance between those two.
Jim, you've been consulted in a ton of organizations. Like, what's the average number of direct reports that your managers would have?
It's a good question. I was kind of thinking about this when you asked James, and I mean, I've been in companies where it's been an average of like 4 to 6. I've seen it as high as 30 to 50. So I guess an average, I don't know, somewhere in the middle, like 15.
So it took
16?
us a while to get to this point, but it depends.
I guess I guess it depends. I'll allow it, counselor. But thinking about what have I seen work well? I worked at one consultancy where the corporate rule was for every direct report someone had, it was expected that 10% of their capacity was consumed. And what that meant is, let's say you had a billable person, not even like you had an execution person, right? You had somebody who's doing something. If you gave them one direct report, they were only now expected to be 90% billable. At 2, it's 20, 3, it's 30, et cetera. And at some point, they'd be like, we're not giving them any more direct reports. Now, I'm not going to say that worked well. I'm by no means going to suggest 10 is the right percent to take for that. But one thing at my highest, I think I had over 40 direct reports, and it was not sustainable, but I was doing a good job. And somebody asked me a couple of years ago, like, how did you deal with that? And I said, well, one way I dealt with it was I told everybody, you're not going to get scheduled meetings from me. This is way before remote work was super common for me. And I had direct physical access to everybody, almost everybody. And I said, if you need me, come find me. If you need feedback, if you need support, come find me. If I need you, I'm going to come find you. So that alone freed up some time. And it kind of put the person in the driver's seat to say, I need this. But I also would like to think I didn't let it go too long where I hadn't talked with certain people. The other way that I addressed it was I had two kind of thought leaders, not organizational leaders, not middle managers, but I had two thought leaders that kept their fingers on the pulse of a chunk of things, people, work, customers, etc. And they were like my early warning system. They were like the canary in the helmet, if you know that idiom, right? Like they were giving me like, hey, I think you might need to talk to Josh. It looks like he's struggling with this, or we have a development opportunity over here, or whatever, which is the only way. Those two techniques and a bunch of other things are the only way I could have even remotely supported such a large group of people.
Yeah.
Do either of you feel it's a reasonable request, like an organizational request for anyone, wherever in the hierarchy, to have 40 direct reports?
Yes.
Why?
Depends on what that means. Like I work with a couple companies right now, and if you log into their HR system, you'll see people with 150 direct reports. But that's not how they actually work, right? So I think you've got how does the company say we're organized, and then how are we actually organized? And it's kind of like surfacing that intrinsic organization. And a lot of these flat organizations or flatter organizations that James referenced, you're going to find somebody who has on paper 200 direct reports.
Oh, sure.
Yeah,
sure.
So that's why I said no. Yeah.
You're creating the system around that, right? So I could imagine that if you have 200, you're going to look for a practical system. So again, maybe not on paper, but that you have seniors that might be coaching or supporting X number of people. Or what will happen is that people will just naturally tend to go to other people because the distance to you might be too far or too difficult to get a hold of. And then it will kind of organically, kind of sort itself. Except from, of course, the difficulty of that you will have to do those evaluations for that many people, which just might make that slightly more challenging.
Exactly.
I think it is an organic thing.
Fair.
Yeah. Yeah. And, I think another thing that I'm a little dismayed that in 2025, this is still considered revolutionary or whatever, is separating what it means to be a manager. Right? Like, I've seen it work extremely well. And I've been in organizations where they've separated the management of someone's skill set, like what they do for this company, and the management of somebody as a human with their career and all that. And that's another way that an organization can start to flatten itself, by separating those. Because anytime you ask one person, like if I ask you, James, to be my manager, and you have to help me get better at what I do for a living, and you have to care about me as a human and my career and my learning and all this stuff, that is super, super hard. And I think what you see in more modern organizations, and like the very well-traveled Spotify model is an example of this, right? Like they separated structure from peer and discipline and chapters, whatever word you want to use, about the people who do the thing that are going to help each other get better at doing the thing. I think there's a lot of different ways to solve that problem, but I'm in favor of separating those two things.
So you have
tactical expertise and career and learning expertise.
I think there can be instances that an argument for that could be made. I mean, if, for example, what tends to happen in many companies, it's that the people that get promoted into leadership positions are often people that are very good in the operation, right? So they're excellent at their area, but they might not be as good as the people part or the people skills. And maybe in that situation, you could make the argument to separate the two, because that's going to be more powerful. On the other hand, you could argue and say, okay, maybe this person has, basic knowledge of what you're doing. Like, for example, a team lead in a development team might not be as technical as some of the other people in the team, but they are better. You hire them to be better on the people side of things, and that can work perfectly too. So I'm not sure. My position would be that to argue in case of either of those, it's depending on what the setup is and what the competencies are that you have.
Well, and maybe as a leader, like when I had over 40 direct reports, it was unreasonable, and no one expected me to be a technical expert
Mm.
in the things my people did. But in that instance, I was. And the reason I got put in a leadership role is I was good at a lot of that work. But those skills atrophy very quick because leadership and management and other things are muscles. And if you skip leg day, your legs are going to get weaker. So if we just assume, like, maybe I'm on the hook, James, for both sides of that equation, right? The tactical expertise and the career and the person side. If I have an area that I'm strong in, great. But I also need to be clear on, if I'm deficient in helping a VMware engineer or a cloud engineer be a better cloud engineer, I need to know, how are my people going to be supported to get better in that? Because otherwise, you're just going to crank out people who are very, they're 50% getting better. Like, they're getting better at one half of the equation, whatever. And now I'm the impediment.
Yeah.
I'm the impediment to their 360 growth, because I can't help them with 360. I can only help them with 180, let's say.
Yeah, and I also think that how companies deal with that, you might recognize that, is creating these ideas of mentorship programs, right? So it might be that you have experienced developers that are part of a mentorship program where less experienced developers can get set together with each other, and they help them for a period of time to improve those skills because the capacity is not there, for example, in a manager. And I think those kinds of systems can be very helpful in that kind of situation as well. And I agree with you, right? That is going to come at a cost, and that's why we need to look at what systems can then work to offset that imbalance.
Yeah. Sunder, I've met your manager or a previous manager of yours, and I suspect, correct me if I'm wrong, if you wanted to get better at being a trainer, like the act of holding a group of people in rapt attention for 2 days, would you go to that person, or how would you develop yourself in that case?
Well, there's two things. One, the manager that you talked to, those two ladies, they're not my manager anymore because that was from my previous department. They will become, long story, they will become my managers again. However, in the current setup, I would not do that because they are not trainers. They have not been trainers. So if I want to become better at my own skill, I'm not going to go to them. I'm going to go to my colleagues who are in the field, who are doing the same thing right now. If I want to become better within the company, whether that's visibility, or more on the business side of things, then sure, yeah, I would go for them because I know that they know their stuff on that side of things, not on the training side. I would come to you, Jim, or to Evelien Roos, one of my colleagues, Willem van Maken, Robin Schuurman, and so on. All these people that I consider to be leaders and experts in their field, because I know they're a lot better than I am.
Well, and here's why I asked, because James, I'm curious what you think about this. Is did the three of us just fall into a trap? And let me phrase it as a question. What is the point of feedback?
What is the point of feedback?
Like, why do we want it? What's the outcome or impact that feedback has? Is it only improvement? Because the trap I'm wondering if we fell in is we're kind of assuming or talking about getting better in this realm of feedback. And I'm just curious, is that the point of feedback?
I think ultimately what it's trying to do is that expand our capacity towards our shared goals. So how can we work together because we're trying to achieve shared goals and we want to increase our capacity to do that. And feedback is a mechanism to start to understand each other. What is important for me and what is important for you? So what is important in why you're choosing certain behaviors or why you're positioning yourself in a certain way? And how is that affecting me? And ultimately, how is that then affecting our shared goal? So I think that is what the purpose is of feedback, ultimately.
Now, the PMs in the audience are going to hear you say the word capacity. And what I think, at least in English, is a better word is, are you talking about capability, expanding our capability to meet our goals?
So I think if I look at capacity, so you have capabilities, but capacity is like if you have 0 to 100 battery capacity, that's the kind of form in which I see that. So if I'm, for example, if I'm very underslept, I'm extremely tired, I have little capacity, for example, to talk about emotions and that kind of thing because there is simply not that energy.
Are
So
you
I compare
referring
it to
to
that.
cognitive ability to actually translate the words that the other is saying into something that's actually usable for you?
To connect to
Yeah.
this other person, to just if you're listening empathically, it takes a lot of energy from you, and if you're underslept, you just don't have what I then call capacity. You don't have that spaciousness to be able to do that. So that's what I mean by that. Does that make
Yeah.
sense, or would that
And I think they're related. They're just maybe not as directly related as people think, because what I see in my work is, hey, we've trained people to do this, so now their capacity should go up.
Mm.
And I'm like, no, actually their capacity may go down, because it doesn't, just because we train them or they're more knowledgeable doesn't mean they're more capable. And it also doesn't mean we put any more hours in their day. But over time, if we get better at something, it normally means we have higher capacity. Meaning, if something that was hard for me that used to take 4 hours is now easier for me and it takes 2, yes, that does lead to capacity. But the only point I'm trying to make is that getting better can create capacity,
Mm-hmm.
but not always and not directly.
Right, because also capacity can vary in terms of other variables that influence that. Right?
Yeah.
And I think that's my position on that. So personal variables can reduce your capacity regardless of how good you are.
Well said.
Well said. Yeah.
Mm.
And I think that's an overlooked aspect in many regards, right? Just because we've been doing it a lot, because we're certified in giving feedback. I think that's the next course that I'm going to teach, certified feedback giver. That we've done it a couple times does not automatically mean that my quality is always going to go and increase.
Of course.
Yeah, that is an expectation, right? I've been giving you feedback. Why are you not still changing that? You know what to do. We've been sending you to a couple days course. Now you should know what to do. Why do I even hire you? Right? Usually it's that part that things are going sideways anyway in the hiring policy, but that's a whole different discussion. I think the perception and the expectations of what's going to happen after someone's receiving and giving feedback is exponentially bigger in someone's mind than it's actually able to translate into something that's actually practical, right? I don't know how that is with you, but when I receive feedback, I'll probably receive the same feedback at least a dozen times before I truly get it ingrained in my system.
Right. Yeah, so I think what's also interesting here is perhaps in what is the quality of connection in those times that you're receiving it. So to what degree is it actually able for you to integrate that feedback in those first couple of times, right? So I can imagine that if people are giving you feedback and it is too vague, or you might have any enemy images of this person that is giving it, it doesn't land. And then you hear it a number of times, and at some point, okay, it starts to land a little bit better, or at some point you hear it from somebody, oh yeah, now I can connect to it, and then it does land. That's a big difference.
Yeah. So just a different environment, or even if it's a different mental environment where you just connect in a different way, can make sure. That's the difference between being aware of truly knowing and feeling it, right?
Yes.
Yeah. And that, I think that's something that goes sideways in many teams, that people know that they should be doing differently, but all of a sudden, like there's a snap.
Yes.
Right. And now I see things in the perspective that I should be putting them in. And all of a sudden now everything makes sense.
Yes.
I gotta say that makes a whole lot of sense to me, because that happens to me a lot.
Yeah.
Like people can regurgitate their words a lot, but all of a sudden I have to see it in a different light, different perspective, or just even in someone else's voice that I have a different relationship with before it actually lands.
Yeah. Yeah. And what can also be the case is, if you've been given feedback about a certain thing that you tend to do in a team setting, is that as that occurs, that you then have a conversation with the person that gave you the feedback, and he says, hey, I noticed that this was happening again. I saw you do that. What was happening for you in that moment? And then you go, oh yeah, it was actually because I wasn't feeling safe. So for example, they've raised their voice. I suddenly realized I just wasn't feeling safe. Okay, that's interesting. So what about what happened didn't make you feel safe? Well, it's Greg, and he always comes across dominating to me. And now we can start to talk about, okay, so what could you do with Greg to start dealing with this situation? And that's when it starts to get integrated, right? And fully lived what's going on.
It's always Greg, isn't it?
Greg is always an easy name for some reason. It's Jack and Craig.
Or Chad.
Yeah.
Super Chad. Go, Jim.
So something I say pretty regularly, and I'm curious, James, what you think is that the absence of feedback is feedback. So my question to you is, do you agree with that, or am I wrong? Or how do you see the absence of feedback?
So, okay, what I could imagine is if we're in a company and you're there and you hardly hear any cases of feedback, that's interesting, because that has me thinking, okay, so why is feedback happening so little here? Is there a safety issue? Are people worried that if they give feedback, they might get hit over the head with it? Or is there some kind of behind the back mechanic going on that people don't say it openly to each other, but they discuss it with others? And that's the way of flow. So I am going to be worried if I'm not hearing examples of feedback around me. And another thing that I find interesting, which I've been hearing from people around me as well, happening is instances where people don't actually go to people, but they go to their manager. Which for me, when we're talking safety, that's when I start to get extremely worried, because that is just detrimental to safety within organizations, and that's when you won't get feedback because people are so afraid.
Yeah, talk with me, not about me.
Exactly. Yeah. And then you also get into those awkward things that they go to the manager, and then if you don't have a manager says that, wow, that sounds really difficult, did you talk with that person about it, right? Where they're trying to urge you to go and talk to the person, that they did go and have that conversation. And imagine that, right? You're in a team and now your manager comes to you to talk about how people in your team have been unhappy with you. You must feel horrible.
Yeah. You're going to feel excluded, left out. Like, people are gossiping about me, around my back. Now I got to constantly have eyes in the back of my head just to check if people are talking about me again.
Exactly.
It's not going to create a safe space. It's going to do the exact opposite.
Exactly.
Now, I want to be mindful of your time as well. You suggested doing a quick role play. Tell me more. Tell us more.
Oh, not per se to do a quick role play. I think one of the interesting things I want to share perhaps on that topic, which is valuable, this might be a segue if you want to go there, tell me, is the power of AI when it comes to this topic. And now bear with me, because I think one area, especially also Scrum Master don't give enough attention to, is how much AI can actually help us in our work. I'm going to give you two examples of this. And the first one obviously is feedback. So there are a lot of prompts that you can use to actually practice your feedback with ChatGPT and in a non-violent communication way. Now, it has one caveat, which is this: ChatGPT makes mistakes, and it makes mistakes, especially when it comes to feelings and expressing those. So ChatGPT might say, when you did this and that, I felt attacked because. And now in non-violent communication terms, attacked is not an emotion. It's a thought that we have. It's doing a guess about somebody's intent on what they're doing to us. But it's a great way to role play feedback before you're going to give it. And when I work in my trainings, I also tell people to go and do that. So of course we practice feedback role plays between people to get the visceral experience, but this is often a much better way to get the training going.
How do you set that up? How do you create a persona of someone that you can actually give feedback to? Because I can imagine if people don't set that up, again, the quality of the reply that you get from ChatGPT is as good as its prompt and its setup. So how do you set up the premise of that feedback, and how do you create the persona?
Yes. So there's this trick, and some people, for some this is obvious and for some it isn't, which is to ask ChatGPT what would be a good prompt. So for example, what I tend to do is I'll start and I'll say something like, I'll give him the context. So I'm in this situation with a colleague. This is what they're doing. And I'd like to practice a feedback conversation with this colleague. I'd like you to play this colleague and that we play this out, right? And then you can start and it will do some attempt. And then I ask it, okay, so what is the prompt that I would give you to do this again? And it gives you that prompt and I start tweaking it. And if you do that sometime, you're going to get exactly where you want to be.
Interesting.
So I don't start with it already perfectly. I just start somewhere. And it's important to give it a context. What am I trying to achieve? And I say, I want this conversation to focus around being empathetic and nonviolent, because that prompts it to think in different ways. And then just build on that. And it's pretty darn good.
Yeah.
The only thing is, it tends to be very nice. And with very nice, I mean, it will kind of, if you do one or two rounds, it'll say, yeah, actually, I agree with you. I should look at this differently or something like that. So another part that I like to say is tell it to make it more difficult. Tell it, well, this colleague is not that easy. He'd probably say something like,
make him less agreeable.
Yeah. Yeah, and
Yeah,
it's really good.
interesting.
It works for team coaching as well. It's so powerful that we're now starting to uncover.
What's the best responses you've ever gotten from ChatGPT?
In terms of silly responses,
No, just the best. Because of course I
Mm.
can imagine silly. That would be a nice one to hear as well. But what's the one that you're actually surprised about? Because I've heard a lot of people lately, like, I practice my job interview. I tried to do this with my manager or with product discovery,
Mm.
and I was really surprised about this and this response. What's the thing that stood out to you most?
Well, so the interesting thing is it keeps track of memory. It has memory now,
Yeah.
right? And I do a lot with ChatGPT. It knows a lot about me. And there was this prompt that I read on Reddit, which was something like, what do you know about me? Or how would you describe me? What do you think my qualities are or my areas to improve? And it did a really touching job. And I was really surprised. And I often talk about empathy with ChatGPT, and it says, it's really important for you that people feel safe and that they're listened to. And it was spot on.
Nice.
It's the memory is good.
Jim, have you ever tried ChatGPT for feedback or
Oh yeah,
any other LLM?
Because the year just ended, I can say that I spent over $900 last year on various AI things between
wow.
my Copilot subscription, my OpenAI subscription, and I also pay for Grammarly, which is a inline, in the moment, AI driven, text thing. And one of the things when you asked James this question that came to mind is Grammarly sends me this summary about like my statistics. And one of the pieces in that summary is, here are the tones detected in your writing.
Mm.
And I would say that 9 weeks out of 10, I look at that and I'm like, yep, don't even give it a thought. But every once in a while, it'll be like, defensive popped in 1 week, or argumentative or weak. Most of the time, like my top couple are confident, knowledgeable, and I think informative or something, right? Which makes sense given what I do. Like if it wasn't things like that, I'd be pretty worried. But what I realize is there's no good way for me to figure out why it came to that thing. I'd like to know what did I write that it felt was weak?
Mm.
What did I write that felt defensive?
Yeah.
And what helped me, and I don't have an answer to this, so if anyone in the audience does, hit me up, but it's capturing everything on every computer I use. So that's personal emails, that's emails to restaurants, that's placing orders for Christmas gifts, it's everything. So it wasn't just work. So the takeaway for me is it's good information, but it's less useful feedback if I don't know where it's coming from.
Yeah.
So but I find, to answer your question succinctly, Grammarly has helped me tremendously. More than any other tool, it has helped me tremendously improve my own writing and write more clearly across cultures and languages, because as you know, I don't just work in one language and culture anymore.
No.
Yeah.
It has helped me too. Like Grammarly Pro, can highly recommend it. I just wrapped up writing my first book. Definitely used the Grammarly to improve my writing style, get a way of redundancies in the way the sentences are set up. So it's not just this kind of feedback, like the personal feedback, but definitely also the way that you write and other stuff. That this is really interesting, and to work with that.
Yeah.
I do want to regurgitate what you were just saying. ChatGPT, etc. They make mistakes.
Yeah.
Like I still see a surge in the amount of people that expect to replace their stuff with ChatGPT.
Yeah.
Don't be one of those people, because it's just a prediction, right? ChatGPT and other LLMs, they make a prediction what the next probable best word is going to be based on all the information that is already currently being fed. So it's ChatGPT knows shit. It knows nothing. It knows no sympathy, no empathy. No, it doesn't know or understand anything. So it's just a prediction.
Yeah.
It's almost like the forecast that we're going to make in our sprint that's probably not going to be correct either.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's why, I think it's a tool, but it won't, at least what I see for the coming years, it's not going to replace expertise.
No.
Because again, when I'm talking about feedback, it makes mistakes that might seem very small, but that are very critical in in the spectrum between connecting with somebody and disconnecting. If you start talking about I'm feeling attacked when you do this or that, you're going to have a bad time, even though it's just one little word.
Exactly.
So that's absolutely true, but it can help you to come with, okay, I want to anchor myself around what is actually going on for me with this person. What is actually the essence or the need behind my feedback? It does a pretty good job of doing that. And that's also a feeling thing. You can feel when it's about right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Jim, let's start bringing this one home. Do you have any last questions?
If you could change one thing about the feedback mechanisms in, your average organization, what would it be? What would you do first?
I'm not sure about the mechanism. I think the one thing that I would love to change is just how leadership would integrate nonviolent communication in how they deal with their reports. I think if we're talking engagement surveys in companies, right? I think that's going to be huge. I think in terms of bottom line impact, that's going to be where you're going to get an enormous return. So it's not so much the mechanism, it's the consciousness with which we are giving feedback. That's what I change.
Nice.
Thank you.
Yeah.
My last one, kicking in an open door. Do you have any feedback on this episode?
I'm gonna be honest with you. This is my first time doing a podcast. I'm probably gonna be sitting in the car or thinking about the silly things that I might have said. So I think I'm gonna be very self-centered in that part. What I do want to say, what I enjoyed very much, is that you both managed to find a way to get me at ease. And I think that has something to do with sometimes you're interacting with each other, asking questions, and you're also sparring, which gives me a sense of, okay, we're doing this together.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I appreciate that.
I love that.
Yeah.
And it's been fun.
Nice.
Yeah.
We loved having you. I really appreciate this conversation. I'm pretty sure that people who are listening are definitely going to take away a ton from this as well. We got you through Martin, one of your previous colleagues.
Yeah.
Sorry, Martin, I cannot pronounce your last name, so forgive me. I'm not even going to try because I'm going to butcher it. But shout out to Martin for getting you on. I really appreciate this conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And James, where can people find you, or like if they want to hear more from you, is there a mechanism right now for that?
Yeah. So one thing I want to do a lot more with this year, and I couldn't. I had a new job last year, so I didn't have as much time, is get back to writing. So I do a lot with feedback training. I love doing that. So you can reach out to me on LinkedIn if you'd like to follow that kind of thing. And I always love
Awesome.
coffees about this.
James de Mulder,
Great.
thank you so much for being here.
Thanks. Cheers.